Welcome to Mindful Reading, where we're going to explore some critical reading strategies and at the same time walk through a little bit of a reflective activity so that you can better understand your own process, look at the strengths of your process, and also develop some strategies that you might want to strengthen throughout the course of our semester and beyond. As you prepare for this particular video lesson, you want to make sure that you have all of the materials that you need in order to take notes regarding the conversation that we're going to have, as well as any reflections that you might want to jot down as a result of what we will go over. The guiding questions for this particular video include: what does it mean to be a mindful reader? What are active and critical reading strategies? And finally, why are they important? And it's here where I'll ask you to reflect on why you feel that these pieces are important in not only your reading process, but also in your writing process. So by the end of the discussion, you should be able to understand how to apply active reading strategies to effectively highlight and annotate a text using a process that best fits your preferred learning style. So let's do a bit of reflection as we begin. The first thing I want you to think about is whether or not you feel note-taking is important. If so, why? If not, why? When we think about the note-taking process, we look at it as a way to actively do something while you're either reading or listening to something. So in essence, what can that do for you? Well, first, it can allow you to have a recorded record of any thoughts that might be coming up as you are listening to or as you're reading something. It also makes you active in the process. The entire act of taking notes is you doing something, which again can solidify your understanding of what it is you are learning. So what is the ultimate goal of reading something? Is it so that we can run through the words and we can read those words, but what is it that we want to do? The goal of reading is to be able to do something with that information. And we say the word comprehension, but I'll extend that just a little bit. Because yes, we want to comprehend something, but wouldn't we like to both be able to summarize it as we comprehend, or summarize it, analyze it, critique it, question it, talk to it? So it's a matter of understanding that reading or engaging with something far extend this idea of reading words, and even in some way, shape, or form extends beyond the idea of comprehension. So think about the last thing you chose to read, and just take a couple of seconds and jot down some things you remember about it. And when I say something that you chose to read, is we all have those things we go to for what I like to call fun reading. Things that were not assigned to you, things that you would grab and pick up and read. Just jot down some things you remember about it. You can stop the video to do this. And when you're ready, click play again. Now think about the last time you read for an assignment. So something that was assigned at school. And I want you to jot down some things you remember about that. Could be things that you remember about the specific text, or how you felt about the text, how you felt about having to read the text, or take notes, or write about the text. Again, stop the video if you need to. And then finally, what I want you to do is think about the reading process for each. Were there any differences to the reading process that you had when you were able to choose the text that you read versus when you were assigned the text? Were there any differences? If so, what? If not, that's great. But jot down any of those things that you noticed or that you remembered about the process of how you approached and completed that reading. So let's talk about mindful reading. When we think about mindful reading, we look at it as a framework intended to remind you of the importance of becoming an active reader. We're going to use that word a lot. An active reader who makes careful and deliberate decisions about the reading strategies that you might use. As you mindfully read, you'll be learning about reading and also about yourself as a reader. So it becomes a reciprocal process. Because as we understand mindful reading and the active reading strategies, we also come to understand our own process or ourselves as readers. These experiences can help us become an altogether stronger reader, not just in this course, but well beyond it. So I want us to, as we walk through this conversation that is happening throughout this video, I want you to think of active reading and the things we talk about, not only in the sense of what they are, but what do they tell you about your own reading process. And as such, I'd like you to take some notes throughout that are very reflective. For example, the first one is, are you an active reader? So as we chat about active reading strategies, make notes of your current reading process. And I show you these two graphic organizers to demonstrate a little bit of something. So you see the one on the left, both of them are the same pyramid, but the one on the right, as you can see, has a screen over the activities where the top part are what is considered passive learning and the bottom part is what's considered active learning. So when we think about passive learning, we think about the reading, the hearing, the viewing, and the watching of the videos, right? So we think about these things, and as you can see, there are percentages next to what is the process that you're going by. So research has shown that if we just read something, and we'll talk about what that means in a second, we'll remember 10%. 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of what we see and hear, 70% of what we say and write, and 90% of what we do. So, if that's the case, if we remember or we can engage or better engage with 90% of what we do, then our question becomes, how do we take the reading process and do something with it? And that's where we can bridge this gap between passive and active. So we want to participate in the reading beyond just the words on the page or the image on the screen or the video that we see or the song that we hear or the speech that we hear. We want to do something with it. And if we realize that we can remember or learn from 90% of what we do, then what we want to do is think about how we can take reading and create a very active process out of it. So when we think about active readers, there are specific things that happen or that active readers do so that they can get to that 90%. One of the first things that active readers will do is set a purpose. So if you remember in my beginning questions were, think of something that you chose to read versus something that you were assigned to read. When we choose what we read, we already have a purpose in mind because we went through a process of choosing it. Many times when we're assigned readings, it's more difficult to set a purpose. So in an academic sense, what we want to do is we want to create a purpose for why we are reading, regardless of what the reading is. Active readers develop pre-reading strategies, and we'll talk about those in just a second. And those are the things that we do prior to even beginning to read a text. Active readers engage actively in the text, and again, we'll look at some strategies for that. Active readers think about what they are reading. So have you ever been reading a text, finished, let's say, a paragraph or a page, only to realize you have no idea or can't remember anything that the page said? This happens to me all the time, and mainly because I'm reading the words, but my mind is not actively engaged because I'm thinking about the 20 other things that are on my to-do list, and my mind begins to wander. In essence, I'm decoding the words because I'm technically reading them, but I am not engaged in them, which means I couldn't talk about them, I couldn't summarize them, I couldn't compare them to anything else, analyze them, and that's because I'm not thinking about what I'm reading. Active readers ask questions as they read. A little bit later on, you'll hear me say that you're going to talk to your text, and that's asking the author or just asking the questions in general. Also, looking for the author's main points. This speaks to also setting that purpose, because if you are automatically saying, what is the author doing with this text, you've automatically set a purpose for yourself. And then also looking for some supporting details. So if you are asking what the author's main points are, the next piece of the puzzle is how is the author supporting their main points? And then finally, looking for those connections to the text. We connect to a text on many levels. Could be something that reminds you of something that you went through. Could be something that reminds you of something that you read prior to, something that you've seen. You're connecting it to a news story, a video, a book that you read, an article that you just saw, or something that you personally connect to because you've had similar situations. So looking for those connections. Again, all of these speak to kind of setting that purpose. This results in what we call critical reading strategies, and these are the things that we do to actively engage in a text. These are things such as previewing a text prior to beginning to read it. Again, we're going to walk through these specifically in just a minute. Contextualizing the text, looking for the context or the moment or historical moment, the social moment in which this article, this text takes place. Questioning to understand and remember. Again, asking those critical questions, not only to question perhaps the evidence or the main points, but also questioning to remember certain aspects of a text. Connecting to the text, just as we just talked about. Reflecting on challenges to your beliefs and values. At the same time, examining your personal responses. So looking at it through the lens of do you agree or disagree and why. Outlining and summarizing are also effective critical reading strategies, and we'll look at that more closely in a video a little bit later on. Evaluating an argument. Again, you're reading this through the lens of your own personal experiences or prior experiences. So I say that we don't enter a text innocently. We come to a text with our own prior knowledge, personal experiences. So when I say evaluating an argument, you're thinking about what is the author's central point? What are they trying to do in the text? And do you think they did it? Did they make their point? Do you agree with their point and why? Is their evidence sufficient? And then, of course, comparing and contrasting to related readings. And I'll say we use the phrase putting them in conversation with other things is extremely helpful. And all of these pieces and parts kind of pull together to create these critical reading strategies. Again, it's that mindful reading of actively engaging with a text. Because if you're keeping some of these things in mind as you read, and we'll break them down a little bit further, is you are really engaging with that text. So let's break it down into some things that you might do before, during, and after you read. So before you read, passive readers will just begin reading. Not that there's anything wrong with that, depending on the type of reading. But specifically reading for an academic purpose or something that you have in class, just beginning reading sometimes, especially if you don't have prior knowledge on the topic, can be a bit daunting. But if you're active readers, you'll preview the text. You'll do things like read the title. What is the title telling you? Look at the author. Who is the author? What makes this person an authority on what they are getting ready to write about? Do you have any prior knowledge for the particular topic? If not, is there something you could do to go quickly get a reference point for what you're about to read? And then set a purpose for the reading. In other words, ask yourself, what do you want to get from the text? If you simply are looking at it from the standpoint of saying, I want to know what the topic or subject of this is, I want to know what the author is doing with this particular topic or subject, and I want to know what the author is doing to support, let's say, their central point or what they're doing with this specific topic or subject. Asking yourself those questions and having them as you read, highlight and annotate, will allow you to then dive further in, and of course setting that purpose for why you're reading. That's done even before you begin to really actively engage with the text or read the text. So let's look at some things that you do during the reading process or during the text. Passive readers will typically read but not write. Everybody has their own process for what they like to have with them and how they want to write in or on their text. I am personally a post-it note kind of a person where I will use my pencil to underline or highlight and then use my sticky notes as my annotations. It helps me zero in on where I was in that text. Passive readers will skip unknown vocabulary words. We'll talk a little bit more about this later. But knowing when you should attend to a word is extremely important. So for example, if you come across a word that if you skip the word, everything after it will not make sense, meaning you will not be able to connect to the text, then that would be a word you would want to stop and attend to. And you can attend to it by looking for context clues and just kind of piecing together the general idea of the word and then moving forward so it makes sense. Or if there is no context within the passage that would help you with that word, you would stop and look for a definition, highlight that word, underline it, make a note next to it so that you can begin to connect and then keep moving forward. Active readers are going to look for key points and answers to questions. So you're going to be constantly highlighting or annotating. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. Key points, answers to questions such as, what's the subject or topic? What's the author doing with this subject or topic? Highlight, annotate, and taking notes. This is going to be super important, specifically when you're reading for academic purposes, because the whole goal is to be able to get information out of the text, because you're either going to have discussions about it or you're going to be writing about it. And if you don't highlight, annotate, and take notes, many times you'd have to go back into that specific text, reread it to try to get the information. Instead, doing this as you're reading it makes this process more effective. Find meanings of new vocabulary words. So it's a little bit different because it's difficult, or it doesn't make a lot of sense to have an article where someone gives you a list of vocabulary words. Part of that is because how do I know what everybody's level or lexicon is? I might highlight specific words that I want to pull out and have a conversation about, but you know which words that you would like to attend to. So finding new meanings or highlighting words that you would like to engage with to find the meanings is much more effective and much more of an active reading process. And then, of course, connecting to the text along the way. You might find a passage, a couple of sentences, a phrase that you connect to in one way, shape, or form. So one of the best things to do is to make note of those connections. This reminds me of, I'm reminded of the time I, or reminds me of the article from so-and-so where he states, this reminds me of a video that I saw, or a news story, or a movie, or a show. Anything that would help you connect to the text, – where in the text you're connecting, make those notes. So when we talk about the during reading process and looking at highlighting and annotating, these two things go together. And here's why. The highlighting of a text is a visual that brings your eyes to a specific section of the text. It says what it is, and it says, hey, this is valuable. But it doesn't tell you why it's valuable. That's what the annotations are for. So the highlighting without the annotations can be a little ineffective or a lot ineffective because in essence you're highlighting at the moment that you're reading, so things are fresh in your mind. But if you were to put that text away even for just a day and go back into it, you may not know why exactly you highlighted a text or highlighted that section. So you want to talk to the text. So the highlighting is to visually draw your eyes to that place. The annotation tells you why you highlighted it. It could be that you highlighted it because you connected to it in some way, shape, or form at that moment. You could have highlighted it because it included a vocabulary word and the annotation is a definition. You may have highlighted it because it is part of the evidence and it's a reason or example that the author gives. You may have highlighted it because it helps you as you begin to construct what the author's central point or thesis or argument in the text is. So highlighting without annotation is ineffective. You definitely want both. And how you annotate is up to you. You notice in the image on the screen that the annotations are next to or written on the text, which is extremely effective. If you're someone who doesn't like to necessarily write notes in the margins, you might consider post-it notes. I will say the only downfall to post-it notes is they sometimes fall out, which means that you've lost the annotations. And while I do use that somewhat to mark my place, I definitely write in the margins quite a bit. We call that marginalia. Those notes in the margin that allow me to go back and see what conversation I was having with the text at the time I was reading it. And it becomes super valuable, especially when you are in the middle of having a discussion, writing summaries, or analyzing a text. Many times you can think of it as talking to your text. You're having a conversation. So again, the highlighting makes the information easily visible, and the annotating adds notes or comments, adds definitions to unfamiliar vocabulary words, writes questions you have from the reading. So very important when we look at, if we go back to that pyramid where it's 90%, we learn at a rate of 90% of things that we do, this is the doing. Talking to your text, not only in the form of the thoughts that you're having as you read, but kinesthetically, highlighting and annotating is you doing something with the text. And now we've just shifted that activity of reading or viewing or looking into something that is a very active process. So what about after we read? We've got before, we've got during. After, just close the book. That's what we would do if we were passive. But we don't want to be passive. We want to be active. So a couple of things that you can think about. While you read, you began to highlight and annotate. Perhaps you began to even analyze or evaluate the text. Some of the things that you might do are jot down some notes, overall notes on what you thought about the text. They don't have to be real deep or real long, just some quick in the moment, because you just finished, so everything is fresh in your mind. So capture that at that moment. So on the last page, or this is a really great index card or sticky page opportunity, is just to draw some quick evaluations of the text. You could develop a graphic organizer or other ways to visualize the text. If you wanted to visualize, let's say, the central argument or points in the text, and then perhaps how the author supported those central points. And then finally, which is something we're going to dive into more specifically in a different video, is to write a summary. We're going to talk about this in the context of creating annotations or an annotated bibliography for things that we read that you would subsequently use when you are writing especially in the academic sense. But writing a brief summary that just states the article's central point and perhaps just the overall main points, jotting some of that down right after you read becomes extremely valuable because, again, now what you've done is you've created this repository. You have these notes that you've taken based on something that you read or listened to or saw that are going to allow you to go back to it and connect as you then read it or write about it later on. The final thing is draw some connections to the text. Be specific in the overview. You did it in your annotations, but now kind of, again, if index cards or sticky notes, what are some connections to the text that you saw? Maybe it reminds you of something that you just read. So what is it about? Contrast it. It could be completely opposite. So contrast it to anything that would draw a connection for you to the text. So when we think about our reading process, we think of it a lot as mining the text. Just like when we mine for valuable minerals, mining a text is, in essence, the intentional process of extracting valuable information that you would like to collect as a result from reading, engaging with a text. So there's a couple of words I want to point out. Intentional. There's an intentional process. What we do in this active reading process or active reading strategies, it's an intentional and purposeful process of extracting valuable information that you collect and can use later on. So critically reading to mine the text, there's a couple of things you want to think about. Find the central point or thesis. Again, what's the subject or topic? What is the author doing with this particular topic? That leads you to the central point. Are they arguing something? Are they comparing something? Are they contrasting something? Are they describing a process? Once you have that, then you can look for, or you can begin to mine the text for the supporting details. How does the author make his or her argument? Look for vocabulary. Vocabulary that either you want to use perhaps in subsequent writings, vocabulary that you don't really quite understand, so you want to make it part of your lexicon, so you highlight it and define it for yourself. Draw some connections to the text. And by connections, doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree. It just means that you're connecting to it some way, shape, or form, even if that connection means that you are contrasting or not agreeing with the author's central point or details. Ask questions about the text. If there's something that doesn't make sense, if perhaps you feel that the evidence that the author is using doesn't make sense, there's holes in the logic, you don't feel like the author or authors have made their argument, so ask those questions throughout. And there's a section I always like to call quotable quotes. It could be that you have found what I call aha moments in the text, and you highlight them, and they become those things that perhaps you might pull as a direct quote in a subsequent writing. So those quotable quote or aha moments are, one, typically they're connections for you, but they become important. So when you get to those moments where you think, aha, just highlight it and make a note next to it. When you're looking for the support for the author's central point or argument, you're looking for things like their reasons. What reasons do they present? What examples do they present it via data, facts, testimonial, observations? So when you're saying, well, how does the author support his or her central point or argument or thesis, you're looking for these things. The author may give only data. They may give only facts or testimonials. More than likely, they're going to give a combination of these things. So just have these in mind as you are pulling out the support for the text's central point or argument. So one of the things that I like to do is to frame it around a set of questions that you might ask yourself as you read. First one being, what is the topic or subject of the text? This is something you can typically articulate in just a few words. The next one is, what is the author doing with the topic or subject? That means that what you're doing is you're really pinpointing the central point. So again, you've got the subject or topic of the text. Then you notice that what they're doing with it is they are comparing it, or they are contrasting that topic with something else, or they could be arguing a specific point with that subject or topic. They could be describing a process using that specific topic or subject. So again, ask the question, what is the topic or subject? Then what is the author doing with the topic or subject? And then how does the author support the central point, thesis, or argument? So as you ask yourself these questions, it helps you even in the process later on when you start looking at writing a summary for it. And then finally, what are your connections to the text? So framing, even with just these 4 questions, when we loop back into the conversation of setting a purpose for reading, having these questions in mind helps to set that purpose regardless of what you're reading. So let's go back to the very beginning when I asked you to think about, or as we walked through, jot down your own reflections to your reading process. So based on our conversation, do you feel you are more of an active or a passive reader? And it's not an either or, because it more works along a continuum from passive towards active. And you're going to say, well, I'm active here, but I'm passive here. And it could be for a variety of reasons, many of which sometimes are because of the purpose for the reading, as we talked about in the beginning, where it was, I chose the reading, so I'm automatically engaged, versus I had this assigned, and I could care less about this topic. So based on our conversation, for the purposes of, let's say, academic reading, do you feel as though you are more of an active versus passive reader? Which of the active reading strategies do you consistently integrate into your reading process? So do you more often than not highlight and annotate based on looking for central point, the support for the central point, vocabulary, connections, aha moments? You might do one of those things, you might do all of those things. Do you think about the text prior to beginning to actively engage in it? Do you connect to prior knowledge? Look for things within the author or the title prior to reading it? After you read, do you jot down a few notes of summary or analysis on the text so that you can kind of close the loop on the text and have something to go back to, that you would be able to instantly connect to the text? And then what I want you to think about is, which active reading strategies would you like to further develop? Realizing that we don't want to say, I'm going to do all of them all of the time. Better yet is to choose 1 or 2 that loop or integrate into your process a little bit more seamlessly, and then build on those. If we try to do all of them all the time, what happens is we start to get too bogged down in those specific steps, but instead start thinking about, well, I do highlight, but I don't annotate, or I don't typically annotate based on those questions that we saw earlier. So perhaps think about those questions and annotate based on that. Or I'm really good at highlighting and annotating, but I don't typically write anything after I read. So now incorporate that after part of just jotting down a brief summary in your words, and perhaps some connections to it. So choose something or a couple of things that you might begin to further develop in your writing process as we move forward into the different texts that we're going to use to then write our projects. I want to thank you for watching. Please realize that you can go back to this video at any time. Now you can head back over to Canvas and continue this week's module. Thank you very much.